Picture this. It is 8:12 in the morning. Somebody opens a doc to send a status update. They pull in last week's notes, a few emails, maybe a spreadsheet, maybe a slide outline. They ask the system for a first pass. It comes back. Fast, clean, useful. Maybe a little too useful. And nobody in that moment says, "We are now entering an AI workflow." They just keep working. That is the change this week. Not that AI showed up. That part is old news. The change is that AI is getting folded into the place work already happens. OpenAI is pitching GPT 5.4 for professional work. Google is pushing Gemini deeper into docs, sheets, slides, and Drive. Anthropic just published research on how people actually behave when AI helps produce polished outputs. So the problem now is not, how do we launch the AI tool? It is, what happens when AI becomes part of the normal work surface before the habits, the judgment, and the second-look discipline catch up? And honestly, that is messier. Because separate tools are easier to govern. Invisible defaults are where people get surprised, and, usually not in a fun way. Welcome to AI Change Desk. AI news you can use and change management you can execute. I'm Michael Hanna-Butros Meyering. Quick disclosure before we start. AI-assisted tools were used in parts of the research and production workflow. Final editorial judgment, risk posture, and release approval stayed human-led. And quick boundary note, this is operational guidance, not legal advice. These are my opinions and are not representative of any organization. One quick bridge, and then we'll get moving. Episode 8 was Validate Before You Scale. Episode 9 was Harden the Controls. Episode 10 was Name the Owners. This week is what happens when the tool stops feeling separate and starts feeling like just work. This is AI Change Desk. Thank you for choosing to tune in. This week gave us 3 signals that really do belong together. Not because the companies coordinated, they did not, but because they all point at the same operational shift. First, OpenAI's GPT 5.4 release is framed around professional work. Not just chat, not just demos, professional work. Documents, spreadsheets, presentations, tool use, software environments. And OpenAI says that on prompts where users had previously flagged factual issues, GPT 5.4's individual claims were 33% less likely to be false, and full responses were 18% less likely to contain any errors than GPT 5.2. Important word there, says. That is OpenAI's own release language, and we should treat it that way. Still useful, still relevant, just not magic. Second, Google published another set of Gemini updates for Docs, Sheets, Slides, and Drive. The details matter, but the bigger signal matters more. Gemini is getting more useful in the files people already live in. The draft, the spreadsheet, the deck, the side panel, the Drive search bar. And Google says those updates start rolling out in beta to Google AI Ultra and Pro subscribers. So again, precise language matters. Not everybody, everywhere, immediately, but direction? Very clear. Third, Anthropic's AI Fluency Index gives us an actual behavioral clue. Not what people claim they do with AI, what they actually do on platform. And that part is refreshing, because a lot of AI discussion still sounds like people describing what they would ideally do if they had infinite time, unlimited focus, and apparently no meetings. Which is not how most of us are living. Put those together and the pattern is hard to miss. AI is becoming less like a separate assistant you visit, and more like a layer riding along with ordinary work. That sounds convenient. Sometimes it is, but it also changes the failure mode. Because when AI feels like a separate thing, people slow down. They notice it. They watch it a bit. They may even act responsible for a few minutes. When AI feels like the document, or the spreadsheet, or the deck, or the search bar, people stop treating it like a separate judgment event. And that is where operators need a different kind of discipline. Not louder, not more theatrical, just more realistic. Story 1. Google's March 10 Workspace update is not interesting because AI exists in Workspace. We already knew that was the direction. What makes it interesting is that the features are getting more useful in surfaces people already touch all day. Docs can draft from your files and emails. Sheets can help build structure and fill things in. Slides can generate and edit presentation content. Drive can answer questions across files. Again, the official announcement says the rollout starts in beta for Google AI Ultra and Pro subscribers, so I do not want to overstate present tense availability. But the operating direction is still obvious. The work surface is changing. And once the work surface changes, management changes with it. Because your real question is not, did we approve the AI tool? It is, which moments inside ordinary work now contain AI judgment? And do workers even notice when they cross that line? That is a better question. Also, a more annoying question. I know, a lot of good questions are. A lot of teams still govern by app label. They say, Google Workspace is approved, ChatGPT is approved, this assistant is approved. That is too coarse now, way too coarse. Inside one familiar surface, somebody can now draft a message, summarize a folder, build a spreadsheet, generate a slide, pull together context, and quietly move from clerical help into actual judgment support. Those are not all the same risk. They are just happening in the same place. That is the important part. The worker thinks, I'm just in docs. The manager thinks, we approved Workspace. Security thinks, this isn't a separate deployment. And then nobody has really answered the harder question. Where does normal productivity stop and AI-assisted decision support begin? That gap is where drift lives. Not very glamorous, I know. Drift rarely is. It usually shows up wearing business casual and pretending everything is fine. The upside is speed. The downside is invisibility. The more natural the workflow feels, the less likely people are to stop and say, hold on, what exactly did this system summarize, smooth over, infer, or quietly leave out for me? That is the trade-off I think teams are underestimating. We spent the last year talking about adoption friction. This year, I think the bigger issue might be adoption without awareness. And yes, I know saying that about a doc editor sounds a little dramatic. I heard myself say it. I had the same reaction. But if the doc editor is where planning, approvals, budget narratives, status updates, and external communications all start, then yes, that surface matters a lot. Not because the tool is evil, because the surface feels normal. If AI is inside the default work surface, your controls have to move closer to the default work surface too. Not a giant policy deck, not a training module hidden in some portal nobody opens after Thursday. You need three things. Plain language use rules where the work actually happens. Obvious moments that require a second look, and workers who can tell the difference between formatting help and judgment help. The line will not always be perfect. That is okay. The point is not perfect taxonomy. The point is not pretending all these moments are identical. Operator line for story 1. The management problem is no longer whether AI arrives. It is that it arrives inside normal work before the organization updates its habits. Story 2. This is where Anthropic's AI Fluency Index is actually useful. Not because it answers every question. It doesn't. Anthropic is pretty clear about the limits. The data comes from 9,830 multi-turn Claude.ai conversations across 1 week in January 2026. So this is not a universal survey of humanity. It is a bounded look at observable behavior in one environment. Good enough to learn from, not good enough to pretend it proves everything. Anthropic found that 85.7% of the conversations showed iteration and refinement. That is encouraging. It means a lot of users are not just taking the first answer and running. But the part I care about more is what happens when AI starts producing polished artifacts, code, documents, interactive outputs, things that look finished. Those artifact conversations made up 12.3% of the sample. And in those conversations, users were more directive up front, but less evaluative on the back end. Anthropic says they were less likely to identify missing context, less likely to check facts, and less likely to question the model's reasoning. That is a very human result, and I mean that with affection. Also concern. When something looks finished, people often switch from interrogation mode to acceptance mode. And yes, I have done this too. You get a clean-looking draft back and your brain goes, great, one less thing for me today, which is relatable. Also how weird assumptions sneak through. Anthropic also says that in only 30% of the conversations did users explicitly tell Claude how they wanted it to interact with them. That means most people are still not clearly setting the collaboration terms. They are just starting the task. Again, very human, not ideal. Teams often assume the risky moment is the prompt. Sometimes it is, but a lot of the time the riskier moment is the handoff from polished output to accepted output. The model gives you a draft that looks complete, a deck that looks presentable, a spreadsheet that looks organized, a memo that sounds weirdly confident. And because the thing looks finished, the human often does less visible checking, not more. That is the part I think leaders miss. They focus on teaching better prompting. Helpful, sure. But if the workflow never teaches people how to challenge polished output, you are just improving the quality of the thing people are tempted to trust too quickly. Better outputs reduce friction, but lower friction can also reduce skepticism. That is the trap. The interface gets smoother, the output looks cleaner, the user feels more productive, and the checking discipline quietly goes down right when the stakes may be going up. So the lesson here is not, people are bad at AI. I don't think that is serious analysis. The lesson is that polished outputs create social pressure to move on, especially in real organizations, especially when everybody is busy, especially when the meeting is already late and somebody says, "This looks fine, let's use it." That sentence has created a truly heroic amount of cleanup work across modern offices. Not heroic in a good way. You do not need to turn every employee into an AI philosopher. Nobody wants that. I definitely do not want that. Sounds exhausting. But you probably do need a few simple habits. Ask one challenge question before using polished output, make uncertainty visible, normalize pushback on anything that looks too clean, too fast. Even one question helps. What is this missing? What should I verify? What assumption is carrying the most weight here? That is not bureaucracy. That is just keeping your brain in the loop after the tool makes something look finished. Operator line for story 2. As AI outputs get more polished, the job is not only to direct the system better, it is to stay critical after the output starts looking finished. Story 3. Now let's talk about GPT 5.4. The most useful part of OpenAI's release is not just that it says the model is for professional work, it is what that phrase now implies. OpenAI is explicitly positioning GPT 5.4 around knowledge work, spreadsheets, presentations, documents, tool use, and professional tasks. OpenAI also says GPT 5.4 is its most token-efficient reasoning model yet, compared with GPT 5.2. And on prompts where users had previously flagged factual issues, OpenAI says GPT 5.4's individual claims were 33% less likely to be false, and full responses were 18% less likely to contain any errors than GPT 5.2. Again, important to say it carefully. That is OpenAI's own comparison language from the release. Useful, relevant, still not a permission slip to stop reviewing things. What I like about this release framing is that it pushes the conversation away from, is the new model smarter? And toward, for this workflow, what error rate and cost profile are we actually willing to live with? That is a grown-up question. It is also the question a lot of teams still avoid, because benchmark talk is more fun than error budgets. It just is. Teams still choose models like they are picking winners in a horse race. Which one feels strongest? Which one demos best? Which one makes the smartest person in the room sound excited? And then they use that decision way too broadly. But once AI is embedded into ordinary work, model choice starts looking a lot more like workflow design. The right model for a first draft may not be the right model for a spreadsheet with financial assumptions. The right model for an internal brainstorm may not be the right model for customer-facing material. The right model for speed may not be the right model for confidence. And if a provider says the model is better for professional work, that is useful. But it is not the same thing as, this model is correct enough for every professional task we care about. That is where teams get sloppy. They hear improved. Then they operationalize it like the word meant solved. It does not. It means improved. Still your problem. The better the model gets, the more tempting it is to standardize everything on it. One model, one default, one approved surface, one set of assumptions. Sometimes that is efficient. Sometimes it is exactly how hidden costs and hidden errors spread faster. Because now the question is not only capability, it is, what happens when this model is wrong? How expensive is it when it keeps reasoning? And where do we still want the human to slow down, even if the model looks stronger than last quarter? That is what I mean by error budget. Not just money, attention, trust, correction load, review time, cleanup time. A model can absolutely be more capable and still create a worse operating pattern if the organization quietly removes too much friction around it. And yes, that is the kind of sentence that sounds obvious after the incident review, much less obvious during the pilot when everybody is excited and caffeinated. Stop asking only, which model is best? Start asking, best for what, at what cost, with what review burden, and what happens when it is wrong in this specific workflow? That is a much better operating question, and yes, less fun at conferences, but way more useful on Tuesday. Operator line for story 3. Model selection is now a workflow decision about cost, review burden, and acceptable error, not just a capability contest. Here's the pattern tying all three stories together. Teams keep governing AI like it is a separate object, a chatbot, a vendor, a rollout, a policy topic. But the actual shift is more ambient than that. AI is becoming part of the default work surface, and once that happens, the mistake is not usually reckless experimentation. It is ordinary overtrust. The doc looks finished, the deck looks fine, the spreadsheet seems plausible, the side panel feels familiar. The new model is supposed to be better, so people move. That is where organizations get themselves into trouble. Not because they were wild, because they were normal. Too normal. The failure mode now looks like this. Nobody clearly marks the moments that deserve a second look. Nobody teaches people how to collaborate critically with the system. Nobody decides which workflows can tolerate smooth AI help versus which ones still need visible friction. So the organization drifts into an operating model it never quite chose. That is the problem. Not adoption, unchosen defaults. And yes, I know that sounds a little blunt, but I think blunt is fair here. A lot of what gets called AI strategy right now is just workflow drift with nicer branding and a more expensive deck. If I were running this review week, I would make 3 decisions by Friday. First, pick one default surface and mark the friction points. Docs, sheets, slides, whatever your team actually uses. Then mark 3 moments where the human is required to slow down. Not everything, just 3. For example, before external send, before financial assumptions are reused, before a polished output gets treated as verified. Second, teach one collaboration habit, not 20. Pick one simple habit and make it standard. What is missing? What should I verify? Where is confidence weak? That is enough. You do not need an 8-step ritual. You need one repeatable behavior people will actually use. Third, separate the fast model from the trusted model. Not every workflow needs the same default. Decide where speed wins and where lower error and tighter review should win. If the answer is, we use the same default everywhere because it is easier, at least be honest that convenience is making the decision. Sometimes that is acceptable. Sometimes it really is not. And yes, this all sounds less exciting than a giant transformation deck, I know. But this is the work that keeps the transformation from turning into cleanup. So the short version this week is this. AI is getting harder to manage because it is getting easier to use. OpenAI is framing the frontier model as a tool for professional work. Google is pushing AI deeper into the everyday surfaces people already use. Anthropic's own research suggests people collaborate actively with AI, but get less critical once the output starts looking polished and finished. That combination matters, because it means the next operating challenge is not just access, not just policy, not just launch approval. It is whether your organization knows where AI has already become part of normal work and whether people still know when to slow down. Episode 8 was Validate Before You Scale. Episode 9 was Harden the Controls. Episode 10 was Name the Owners. Episode 11 is this. When AI becomes part of the default work surface, invisible habits matter as much as visible controls. Listener question. Where in your organization has AI already stopped feeling like a separate tool? And is that where your people are most careful or least? This is AI Change Desk. Until next time. This is AI Change Desk. See you next time.